good-looking man will marry a strong, good-looking woman. They believe that beauty is it's a sign of health, and of course, health is strength. Strength is power. Beauty, therefore, equals power. And the couple is married, and their task of this couple, the aim of the family, is to produce children. Children who will be soldiers or children who will be the mothers of soldiers. And once the baby is born, according to some accounts, they are inspected by officials. And if the child has any defect, visible defect, he is left to die of exposure, meaning that he's taken out to a secluded place, abandoned there, and the baby will die, and or even worse, will be devoured by beasts. Now, this is against everything that seems to be part of civilized society, right? To abandon someone who is less than capable to survive. And yet they did it. But we have to understand something. The Spartans didn't write anything about themselves. All we know from Sparta is from people who either hated the Spartans or people who admired the Spartans. And in either case, their opinions might be a little biased. Now, the fact that this is recorded by several sources might be an indication that maybe there's some truth to this. What we don't think is true is the whole notion that they would go to a cliff and throw babies off a cliff. That seems an exaggeration. Although, in Athens, a different city, archaeologists found a well where there were hundreds of skeletons of babies that had been thrown there. And what researchers found is horrifying, but also very interesting. At least one third of those children had died of meningitis. And apparently, that was a very common illness. When the umbilical cord was cut from the baby, very often that's when the infection took place. If the instruments are not sterilized, which they weren't at that time, meningitis can develop. So a large number of children died of that. So a lot of these children were, after they died, were probably thrown into this well. Uh, Maybe there's some religious significance to that. Also, there were children who did not show any sign of a particular illness, so we don't know. It's a mystery. There's no answer to that. But the fact that those skeletons were found not in Sparta, by the way, in Athens, may point out that this practice of getting rid of what they would see as defective individuals uh, would be common not only to Sparta but maybe to other societies. We know that the Guarani Indians of Paraguay did that when a couple had, for example, if a couple had two children and they gave birth to a third one, they would kill the third one because in the jungle they had to constantly be on the run, and a couple could not take care of that third baby. We know that in Nordic societies, children with defects would be left to die of exposure. So it's not unique. What is unique about this is that this is a civilized society. This is a society that consciously makes the decision that we don't want the weak, because they have only one directive, one imperative, which is whatever makes Sparta strong is good, whatever makes Sparta weak is bad. Sparta cannot afford to take care of the weak. And you will see how that notion is implemented as time goes on. There's also another element here. There's the element of developing a superior type of individual, almost like breeding a perfect race. This is what is known as eugenics. Eugenics is to create a better race. And we know how these notions were embraced in the 1930s, right, and 40s by the National Socialists in Germany. They wanted to create that perfect race, or actually they thought that they were the perfect race, but they also wanted to produce these superhumans. That notion is very old. It goes all the way back to the Spartans. to this idea that they want to create the perfect soldier, and therefore they cannot afford anyone who is substandard. Of course, things can go wrong. And according to Aristotle, a monarchy can degenerate into a tyranny, which is the abuse of power by one man. By the way, before Aristotle, tyranny was not necessarily a bad term. It simply meant illegal government, someone who came to power illegally. But Aristotle will define it as the abuse of power by one man. So monarchy can become tyranny. The aristocracy, which is supposed to be the rule of the best, uh, can degenerate into oligarchy, which is the rule of the few. That's what the term literally means. But who are these few? Well, he was thinking the wealthy. An oligarchy is the rule of a state by those who have money. And that means that their interest will be to become even wealthier. And that's not a good system. And then a polity, which is a government through collective agreement and consent, can become a democracy, which is not necessarily a bad thing according to Aristotle, but not necessarily the best thing either. There was a lot of skepticism about democracy in ancient times, and when Aristotle wrote his book, some things had happened with democracy that make him think that maybe democracy is not the best thing. Democracy is the rule of the people. And what this shows is that, well, maybe you cannot trust the people from Aristotelian perspective. So the best system would be a polity in his view. Democracy is not the best, but it's not necessarily as bad as oligarchy and tyranny. So it's something that he regards as acceptable. When it came to Sparta, Aristotle believed that Sparta was a mixed constitution because it had elements of all the different systems. Sparta had two kings, so it's a monarchy. Sparta was ruled by the Gerousia, which is a council of 30 men from selected families. That sounds like either an aristocracy, uh, an aristocracy, an oligarchy in the sense that it's the government of the few, but they were not necessarily the wealthiest. So oligarchy doesn't really apply to Sparta. It's more like an aristocracy. The five efforts were elected every year. That's an element of democracy. And there are many aspects of how Sparta's society operates that are actually a polity. So Sparta combines elements of all these different forms of government that Aristotle considered are the categories found in Greece at the time that he lived. Of course, he believes that these are more than just categories that apply to Greece. These are, in a sense, kind of universal categories. And when you read his book, you realize that some of the analysis that he provides even applies to modern day politics. Would be a good exercise for you to think, what kind of government are we? Is the United States uh, really what it claims to be, or do we fall under different Aristotelian categories? Before joining the army, the young men, and this is probably by the time that they are about 20 years old, they join something called the Crypteia. And the Crypteia is a secret force that is sent out to Messenia, and their task is to capture and kill helots. Every year, the first order of business for the Gerousia and later the Apella, the assembly, was to declare war on the Messenians. And the reason they did that is because, first of all, the Greeks were very legalistically minded. The reason they did that is because when you declare war on the Messenians means that if you kill any one of them, it's legal because you're at war. So a young man would be sent to live on his own in the wilderness of Messenia, which, by the way, was pretty rough and it could get cold, very cold in winter, not too many resources. I don't know if you ever watched that show, Naked and Afraid, where the people are put in natural environments and they have to survive. That's kind of what the young men in the Cryptea did. They were placed out there on their own, or sometimes in small groups, and their task was to stalk helots. And when you saw a helot that was particularly good looking or stronger or had a reputation for being smart, what do? You hunt him down and you kill him. This kind of ritualistic human hunt is the rite of passage for the young Spartan soldier. And this is actually an artistic photograph that I found on the web representing a group of helots who have just been killed by a squad of the Cryptea. Of course, this has another role because that means that the Messenians, the helots, are always on the watch out. They know that they cannot, you know, overstep their boundaries because they will be killed by the Cryptea. And now the young man joins the army. He's now a member of a syssitia. A syssitia is a squad, and these men are his family. For the rest of his life, he will have breakfast, lunch, and dinner with them. He will sleep in the barracks with them. That is the life of the Spartan soldier. And in this image to the left, you see the standard equipment of the Spartan. He has a uniform. Uniforms are perhaps invented by the Spartans. In the rest of Greece, remember, soldiers had to pay for their own equipment. Well, here the state provides the best equipment. You have a very nice linothorax to protect the upper body. You have greaves made of bronze, the big shield with the letter there is the letter lambda, which stands for L, which means Lacedaemonians, the sword and the spear, and of course the helmet with plumes, and a cape, a red cape. Red was very often the sign of royalty. And of course, they think that they're superior and therefore they deserve to wear these beautiful red cloaks. These young men are now completely devoted to the service of the state. And according to ancient writers, when the young man went to battle, he would go to his mother's house, say goodbye, and the mother would say, either come back with your shield or on your shield, meaning either go there and be victorious or die in battle. There's no other choice. That represents the values of the Spartans. And then the next step in life, marriage. Marriage is not about marrying the person that you love, the woman of your dreams, none of that. Marriage is service to the state. The state is supreme. Everything that you do is for the well being of the state. Marriage is arranged by the government. They decide who you marry. Remember eugenics, trying to create the perfect race? You match the best looking person, the strongest, best looking man with the best looking woman. And Spartan women were famous for their beauty. Of course, in the legend, Helen of Troy was originally from Sparta, supposedly the most beautiful woman in the world. Marriage is interesting because it's arranged by the state, and then there's no marriage ceremony. The day of the wedding, in quotation marks, the woman is shaved. They cut their hair. Uh, and then she wears the cloak of a man and sits in her room. The groom then enters in the middle of the night and he ritualistically kidnaps her. He takes her away to their new house. And then they consummate the marriage. And then he leaves. He stays in the barracks with the other men. And every day he visits the wife. Every night, I should say, to have intercourse with her. Until one day she says, I'm pregnant. And then he says, okay, fine, see you in 9 months. Uh, Interesting situation, right? And we think that part of this whole ceremony reflects an element of Spartan society, that the sexes are segregated. The boys are taken away when they're 7. And they, of course, there's some interaction still with the family, but for the most part, they live in this completely separated world. Women are strange beings to these young men, and it's probably very difficult to interact with them. So that ceremony is very strange, and no one has adequately explained why it happened. And then the marriage is, is not really a relationship in the modern sense of the word. It is basically a social device created so that babies can be produced for the state, and that is the task, to produce babies. Another element of Spartan society that is very interesting is the condition of women in their society. To understand how different they were, we need to look at what the condition of women was in the rest of Greece. In Corinth, in Athens, in Thebes, in Argos, in every other city, women were always on a second plane. They were always under the authority of a man. When they were children, they were under the authority of their father. When they got married, they were under the authority of their husband. When the husband died, they were under the authority of their son. A woman in Greece could not make a decision on her own. Women in most of these cities could not own property. They could not inherit property. They could actually hold it and pass it on to male children, but they could never be actual owners. Women did not receive an education. Greek women were not allowed to go outside without the company of a male or an elderly woman who acted as a chaperone. We also note that in many, at different points in Greek history, women were required to wear a veil in public if they were married. Only the husband was allowed to see her face. So they had to cover their faces in public. Uh, there was a section in the house, in Greek households, called the gynoecium. That was the women's quarter, that the women could only live in that part of the house. And if visitors came in, the males could not go into that area. They had to be in the area for males, and the women had to go to the gynoecium. So the lives of Greek women were very limited, but not in Sparta. And that's what makes Sparta extraordinary. Little girls did not go to the agoge, but they trained. They stay at home, but then they trained. They were extremely athletic. And this painting right here is from a French painter, Degas, who shows Spartan girls inviting boys to play with them or do exercise with them. It is not clear how much contact there was between boys and girls. There is some indication that they may have sometimes practiced together. But what we do know is that Spartan girls were taught to be very physically active. And they were not ashamed of showing their bodies. They actually were very proud because they were very athletic. And actually, the Spartan women redefined the concept of beauty for females. In most societies at the time, being fat was considered beautiful because it was a sign of wealth. Well, in Sparta, female beauty is defined by athleticism. The slim, athletic body is the model, the ideal of beauty for women. And these little girls who are raised in their household without their brothers, because remember, after 7, the boys all go to the agoge, were also raised to be extremely independent, extremely self sufficient. They were expected to be that because the men would not be around. These girls learn how to offer their opinion whenever they wanted. And that makes them very different from women in other parts of Greece. Their experience is going to be extremely different from most Greek women. And I would say from most women at a time. In this image, we see the depiction of a Spartan girl. And it's interesting. You see what she's wearing? She's wearing a cloak that is only strapped on one side, and one of the breasts is showing. Apparently, the reason for that is that these women needed to have something that was practical to exercise. These women were not sitting at home only weaving like on the other Greek women. These women were extremely active. And so even what they wore, even the clothing that they wore was very different from the other Greek women. Actually, Greeks from outside Sparta called them, there was a very long Greek term that basically means uh, thigh shower, because the garment that they wore was open on the side, so you could see the thighs of the Spartan women. Remember that women in the rest of Greece they were completely covered, even their faces were covered. Women in Sparta managed the household. Remember, they lived in a society where the men were never around. They were either training or they were at war, so they ran the household. The women ran the property of the family. If you could go back in time and be in Sparta in the middle of the day, what you would see would be a lot of women with their children going about their business by themselves. Spartan women were extremely independent and they were very opinionated. And actually, other Greeks made fun of Spartan men because they said, "Oh, your women talk too much. Your women have too much of an opinion," because that was not the case in the other places in Greece. So the condition of Spartan women is quite special. No other women had as much freedom as the Spartan women. In Sparta, when people died, they were buried in unmarked graves. Only two kind of people deserved a tombstone with their name. One was a warrior who had died in battle, and the other was a woman who had died during childbirth. And that's very significant because what that shows is that this woman who's given birth, she's a soldier. She's fighting for Sparta the same way that the warrior is fighting on the battlefield. So if a warrior dies, he must be remembered. And that's the only reason why you should be remembered. If you died of natural causes, you'd never pay the ultimate sacrifice. So you're put in an unmarked grave. But if you die in battle, you're a hero. And now a woman who dies in childbirth is given the same honor. That is extremely significant. In terms of the economy, Sparta is quite interesting because it was kind of a collectivist economy. First of all, Spartans had only one mission, which was to train and fight. So manufactured goods were produced by the periokoi. Remember the ones who lived around? They made weapons, baskets, pottery, tools, construction, clothing. All of these things were produced by the periokoi, and they were also merchants. They were allowed to trade these goods with other places. So the Spartans were provided with everything they needed in terms of manufactured goods by the periokois. The Helots produce agricultural goods. Remember the farming that takes place in Messenia. Each family, when a young man marries a woman, the family gets a lot of land, an estate in Messenia and Helots, so that they don't have to worry about their income. Their income comes from that estate. The family is also given a house. And by the way, all the houses look the same because in Sparta, equality is important. That's why the homoi are literally equal. Even the king has the same amount of land. Even the king lives in the same type of house. There are no luxuries in Sparta. But on the other hand, when you get married, you know that you will be provided for because you have an estate in Messenia that is where helots work, and you have a house that is given to you by the government. In a sense, there is almost like a socialistic uh, element to that. Money was eliminated. And the reason for eliminating money is that if money exists, some people will accumulate more. And once you have economic differences, you cannot have absolute political and social equality. So they eliminate money. What they did have was these tokens made of iron that had no value except in Sparta. It's like when you go to Coney Island and you want to ride those the different games that they have, you buy those little tickets, and those tickets allow you to buy cotton candy and sodas and go on the different rides. But outside, the park, they're worthless. Well, that's Spartan money. They have pieces of iron that have no value except within Sparta. And the purpose is to eliminate the accumulation of wealth, because with those little tokens, all you can do is exchange them for some necessary goods. No one is going to accumulate pieces of iron and become rich. So the market economy disappears. And again, the purpose is to achieve complete economic equality for the homoioi. Women do not wear jewelry. The houses of the Spartans are very, well, they're very Spartan, right? The term Spartan has come to know very austere. You only have what you need, because what they devote their lives to is the service to the state. And some of the Greeks who had the rare opportunity to visit Sparta were completely amazed at the way of life of the Spartans, the communal life, the discipline, the separation of the sexes, the freedom of the women. That scandalized some Greeks. But even what they ate, for example, the Spartans were famous for eating the something called the blood soup. Blood soup is pig's blood with chunks of meat and fat, which apparently was horrible. It's probably as bad as it sounds. And one ancient writer who visited Sparta said that after seeing and after tasting that famous blood soup, he understood why the Spartans were so willing to die in battle. Uh, because the Spartan soldier did not live for comforts. The Spartan soldier was tough. The Spartan soldier was the happiest when he went to battle. Went to battle, they would go and they would polish their shields. Spartans, by the way, wore long hair. Greek men would cut their hair; that was their fashion. But Spartans had long, flowing hair, and they would be they would be seen before battle, polishing their shields, combing their hair, oiling their bodies. Going into battle was almost like a religious experience. They would go because this is what they trained for their whole lives. So, how successful was the Spartan experiment? Extremely. A small city state with a very reduced population became the master of Greece at one point. They were the best soldiers in the world, probably the best soldiers in history. The Spartans um, were as good as their training. They were as tough as their reputation. They were as good as their reputation. They were excellent in battle. They were cohesive. They accomplished things that are the stuff of legend. Of course, that battle of the 300 at Thermopylae immortalized it. The idea that you die because you are willing to sacrifice your life for the state. Why? Because the state is everything. Your life is meaningful only because it is in the service of the commonwealth, of the state. And this takes us back to that idea of freedom, right? The Spartans were the envy of the Greeks. The Greeks didn't see it, look at Sparta and say, "Oh, look, they are oppressed." No, the Helots might be oppressed, but the homoioi, that was the embodiment of freedom from, in a very extreme way, from the point of view of the Greeks. Because remember, what are the things that Greeks want? They want to be good in battle. The Spartans were excellent in battle. You want to be free from foreign domination. The Spartans did not even have walls around their city because they said, our soldiers are the walls. And that's a very bold move, right? To say, no, we don't need to build walls. We're not afraid. It's an incredible statement. So they were free from foreign occupation. And the other thing that Greeks valued a lot was the sense of community, belonging to something greater than yourself. And of course, these young boys who went to the Agoge and these young girls who trained to be mothers of soldiers, they all were part of this common cause, which was to make Sparta strong. And they succeeded. They considered themselves freer than anyone. They didn't like anything, right? They had education, they had the estate with the Helots, they had a house, and all they had to do was train and be ready for battle. And what is the worst thing that can happen to you in battle? Die. And even that is not bad, right? Because that means that your name will be remembered for generations as a hero, as someone who served the state. I think that the epitaph that was written about the Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae is very important. Remember, Thermopylae is when they defeated the 300 defeated the Greeks, the Persians. I'm sorry. And the epitaph says, "Passerby, go tell the Spartans that here 300 of their men died, fulfilling the law." Those 300 men did not even see themselves as heroes. They just said, "We have to do what you have to do. This is what Spartans do. We serve the state. And if we die in the process, nothing special. This is what is expected from us." So the Greeks looked at Sparta with admiration. Now, this is the kind of thing that, sometimes, you go to the gym and you see someone who's in top shape and say, I wish I could be like that, but I don't have the discipline to be like that. That's the way that the Greeks felt about the Spartans. Every Greek wished he could be like a Spartan, but no other society had this incredible drive to transform themselves into a society that is so unique, and yet a society that is so much part of the legacy of the West. Because if you look at modern democracy, communism, fascism, National Socialism, every modern ideology or form of government has a little of the Spartans in them, the good and the bad, right? The concept of the state, the concept of citizen, all of those concepts, the extreme to which they went to achieve those goals, that remained their legacy. There's nothing left of Sparta except those few walls that you see on the ground. But the real legacy of Sparta was the creation of this idea of citizen and this idea of the state that remained throughout antiquity, the Middle Ages, and modernity, a model. And sometimes that model developed into a totalitarian state like Nazi Germany or fascist Italy, or to some extent the Soviet Union under Stalin. But on the other hand, the legacy of the Spartans also exists in democracies. The idea of complete equality, the idea of uh, responsibility, social responsibility towards each other, and the responsibility of the state towards its citizens, which is also an element of Spartan thinking. That is present in modern ideas of democracy too. So the Spartans are extremely important, and they're more than just warriors who battle and are very good at fighting. There's much more to Sparta. The concept of the Spartan state will also inspire the philosopher Plato, who wrote a book called The Republic. And in The Republic, he imagines what the perfect society, the perfect system of government will be. And that society is a state where uh, the government controls every aspect of life. Because for Plato, that was the greatest expression of freedom, just as the Spartans thought that the greatest expression of freedom was the system that they had devised for themselves.